At least 38 residents of this apartment building heard her screams and did nothing.
Welcome to MsMojo, and today we're looking at crimes that impacted the legal system and shaped the laws we live by.
I just signed into law the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act.
Veronica Garin. A tenacious investigative reporter, Veronica Garin was one of the most well-respected journalists in Ireland during the 1990s.
I'm not the only crime reporter that, does this, and I think that the regrettable thing is that we're all probably targets, unfortunately.
Known for building strong relationships with her sources, Garin doggedly pursued her stories, occasionally putting her own safety on the line to secure interviews. She also did not shy away from contentious topics. Ultimately, her work covering organized crime led to her death when a South Dublin drug cartel ordered a hit on her in 1996. Following her murder, the Irish Parliament enacted the Proceeds of Crime Act and the Criminal Assets Bureau Act.
That seminal moment in which Veronica was shot, I think, woke people up. It was a shock to the system, to everybody in the country, that, these people are gaining the ascendancy in our society and we have to stop them.
These two acts enabled the government to seize assets bought with money acquired through criminal activity and led to the formation of the Criminal Assets Bureau. Carl Stark. After her son was murdered in the parking lot just outside of her home, Anita Waring Kennedy pushed to see a change in the law.
We want everyone to know that he never had an enemy and had the purest heart.
On August 18, 2015, two men targeted Carl Stark, who had autism, while he was shopping at a store near his home. When Stark left, the men followed him, later killing him during a failed attempt to steal his car.
The loss our family has suffered doesn't make sense. It is something that you never expect to happen.
In 2016, Carl's Law was officially enacted in the state of Florida. The law permits the reclassification of criminal offenses when the victim involved has a mental or physical disability, thereby allowing officials to hand down harsher punishments. Andrew Harper. On August 15, 2019, police officer Andrew Harper responded to a burglary in progress.
The teenagers had that night gone to steal this quad bike. The bike's owner watched on as the theft unfolded.
While attempting to catch one of the suspects on foot, Harper got caught in a tow strap hanging from the back of the getaway vehicle. Harper was dragged for a mile before becoming disentangled from the strap. He was pronounced dead moments later. His death received national attention and resulted in significant public outcry.
Their case for murder was that the teenagers knew the officer was behind the car and had intended to kill him, but the jury wasn't convinced and convicted on manslaughter instead.
Harper's widow launched a campaign to make life sentences mandatory for those found guilty of the manslaughter of emergency service workers during the commission of a crime. As part of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, Harper's Law received royal assent in 2022. Tracy Thurman. After months of horrific abuse and unrelenting harassment, Tracy Thurman was attacked by her husband in front of her home. A police officer was on the scene, but despite the brutality of the attack, the officer failed to intervene. In fact, Thurman's husband went after her 2 more times during the incident, inflicting even further injury before the officer finally arrested him.
No. She's mine! She's mine! Get him out!
It took Thurman 8 months to recover, and she was left with partial paralysis. In a landmark lawsuit, she sued the town and the police department for violating her civil rights. The case brought about significant change to domestic violence laws across the United States, including the Family Violence Prevention and Response Act in Connecticut, which makes arrests in domestic violence cases mandatory.
The case forced police departments nationwide to reassess their policies toward spousal abuse and protect women when threatened by their husbands.
Drew Shadeen. On Saturday, November 22, 2003, Drew Shadeen wrapped up her shift at the local mall, did a little shopping, and then headed to her car.
Drew had been talking on the phone from roughly 5 p.m. to 5:04 p.m. to her boyfriend, and that phone call was interrupted, and she abruptly hung up. Prior to doing so, she said something along the lines of, okay.
It appeared to be a typical day for Shadeen, but her friends and family began to worry when she later failed to show up at her other job. She was found dead the next week. Her murderer was identified as Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., a convicted sex offender recently released from prison. Rodriguez was classified as a level 3 sex offender at the time, which indicated that he was highly likely to re-offend. Following Shadeen's murder, legislation was passed in 2006 that established the Drew Shadeen National Sex Offender Public Website.
NSOPW is the only federal website that searches public sex offender registries in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, the 5 principal U.S. territories, and participating federally recognized Indian tribes.
The registry allows users to access information about sex offenders nationwide. The Manson Family murders. While almost everyone is familiar with the infamous Manson family murders, few people realize how the cult's crimes affected the legal process.
They were average American kids, and that's what was so shocking. You would never dream that these people would be mass murderers, so it shocked the entire country.
Following Sharon Tate's murder, her mother, Doris Tate, became an activist who fought for victims' rights. She joined the Victim Offender Reconciliation and Justice for Homicide Victims group. She was also instrumental in getting the Victims' Rights Bill passed in 1982. Victims in every state are now allowed to give victim impact statements against violent attackers, either written or verbal, during the legal process.
And Doris Tate, who has become an internationally recognized champion of victims' rights, didn't confine her anger to our interview.
Doris Tate was even the first person to make a victim impact statement when her words were read aloud at a parole hearing for a Manson family cult member in 1976. Kaden Manuso. Jeffrey Mancuso had a history of explosive anger and mental health issues. He disfigured a man in a fight in 2012 and mistreated animals in front of his family. But despite such violent tendencies, he was awarded unsupervised visitation with his daughter Kaden.
I still don't feel like it's real. I still feel like I'm going to wake up from this awful nightmare, and but I know that I'm not.
Her mother fought to keep Kaden safe by seeking restraining orders, but it was no use. On August 6, 2018, after a scheduled visitation with her father, Kaden Manuso was found dead in her father's home. Kaden's grieving mother and stepfather fought to change custody laws, and in 2024, Kaden's law was signed by the Pennsylvania governor.
Most of the times parents can put their child's needs first, but sometimes that child's safety needs to be prioritized. Kaden's law is Pennsylvania's efforts to make sure tragedy never happens again.
The law strengthens existing safety conditions and restrictions to help prevent abuse in court-ordered visitation cases and increases the factors judges must consider before granting custody. The Dunla Massacre. On March 13, 1996, a local shopkeeper walked into Dunblane Primary School in Dunblane, Scotland, and opened fire.
That will go down in history as one of the worst massacres ever.
Nobody had planned for anything like this in Dunblane.
In under 5 minutes, he killed 17 people and injured 15 others before taking his own life. The attack remains the deadliest mass shooting in UK history. In the wake of the Dunblane Massacre, grieving parents and activists called for significant gun reform. After intense public debate, private ownership of most handguns and semi-automatic weapons was banned the following year.
They just showed people how you can recover and you can make changes to the law for other people, and I just thought that they showed tremendous courage, the people who were behind that campaign.
Parliament also enacted mandatory registration for shotgun owners. In the decades since the Dunblane Massacre, there have been no other mass school shootings in the UK. Helen McCort. On February 9, 1988, Helen McCort headed home after work. She had plans with her boyfriend and was anxious to prepare for her date. She never made it home.
We started ringing around hospitals, our friends.
I thought, oh my God, something's happened. That's when I went into panic.
As evidence surfaced, it became clear Helen had met with foul play. Although her body was never found, authorities were able to gather enough evidence to convict local pub owner Ian Sims. McCort and Sims had argued shortly before her disappearance. Helen's mother advocated for new legislation concerning convicted killers who withhold information about their victims.
You want this for a change in the law to deny parole to killers who don't disclose the location of their victims' bodies.
Under Helen's law, offenders who conceal information about their victims face longer prison terms. The law received royal assent in 2020. Sims was released before the law was passed and later died without ever disclosing the location of Helen's remains. The Mississippi burning murders. In June 1964, during the height of the civil rights movement, a major initiative was underway to register black voters in the southern United States.
For trying to exercise rights, for trying to help others exercise rights, people paid with their lives.
It was called Freedom Summer, and in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the Ku Klux Klan was not happy about it. They launched their own campaign, one of terror and intimidation, to counter the initiative. 3 activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, went missing and were later found dead. The murders ignited national outrage. Ultimately, 19 people were charged in connection with the crime, including the local sheriff.
The FBI arrested 21 Klansmen, charging 19 of them for conspiracy to injure, oppress, threaten, and intimidate the civil rights workers.
The events sparked landmark federal legislation prohibiting racial discrimination in voting, the Voting Rights Act, which was signed into law on August 6, 1965. Claire Wood. Around the world, many women have lost their lives at the hands of their partners or ex-partners. On International Women's Day in 2014, a law was implemented in England and Wales that could significantly reduce the frequency of such tragic incidents.
I see no reason why that information shouldn't be passed on so you can make an educated assessment of your predicament and will I stay or will I go.
Claire's Law, also known as the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, grants a person the opportunity to find out if their partner has a history of violent behavior. The law takes its name from Claire Wood, an English woman who was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, George Appleton.
This young lady said, sorry to trouble you, Mr. Brown, you deserve better than this. We've just found your daughter's body.
Appleton had served prison time for violence towards women, a record that was unknown to Wood at the time. Today, other parts of the UK, Australia, and Canada have all adopted Claire's Law. Daniel Morham. On December 7, 2003, Daniel Morham was last seen waiting for a bus somewhere in Queensland, Australia. According to reports, when the bus finally came, it failed to stop and pick him up because the driver was running late.
Ultimately, for Daniel, the difference between life and death came down to just 3 minutes. A tiny moment in time, but as it so tragically turned out, certainly long enough for evil to strike.
Morham was apparently abducted shortly after by Brett Peter Cowan, a known predator, and he was declared missing until 8 years later when his remains were found. In 2014, Cowan was arrested and sentenced to prison for life.
And then you heard those 3 words, guilty, guilty, guilty.
I muttered under my breath, yes. I wanted to scream out, but I just knew I couldn't do that.
As a result of the case, Australia implemented the No Child Left Behind policy, which mandates bus drivers to always stop and pick up children, even if they can't pay the fare. Lee Rigby. Lee Rigby was a British Army soldier who lost his life in an attack on May 22, 2013. Rigby's assailants, Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale, claimed to have carried out the attack in retaliation for the victims of British military action in Islamic countries.
A terrible murder has occurred. We've launched an investigation led by the Counter-Terrorist Command, and we've made 2 arrests in relation to that awful crime.
The 2 men waited at the scene until police arrived, at which time they were subdued and arrested. It's believed that Adebolajo and Adebowale had been radicalized to commit such a crime in the preceding years.
British converts to Islam had gloried in Lee Rigby's barbaric murder, according to the judge. It was a crime that had appalled the nation. 3 protesters were arrested outside the Old Bailey as the men were sentenced.
In a bid to prevent further instances of this, then British Prime Minister Theresa May introduced the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act in 2015. The bill requires internet providers to keep records of users who access certain IP addresses. Andrew Bagby and Zachary Turner. The 2008 documentary Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father, detailed the tragic case of Andrew Bagby and Zachary Turner. Bagby was an American medical student schooling in Canada when he met Shirley Turner.
I was excited at the thought that maybe he had found somebody that he, could really be happy with. But that turned out that way.
Their relationship produced 1 child, Zachary, who Bagby never got to see as he was murdered by Turner months before the boy was born. While out on bail, Turner gave birth to Zachary and remained in custody of him. However, before she could stand trial for Bagby's murder, she took her own life and that of her son. After the documentary was released, Canadian Parliament passed Zachary's bill, which would deny bail to people on the grounds that doing so will protect their children.
It doesn't bring either of them back, but it's the best we can get. We hope it will save lives. We'll never know for sure.
The Chicago Tylenol poisonings. You most likely won't buy a bottle of over-the-counter drugs if its seal is broken. That level of assurance is only possible today because of the Chicago Tylenol incident. Back in 1982, several bottles of Tylenol were tampered and laced with potassium cyanide.
The bottles were labeled extra strength Tylenol, 50 capsule size, lot number MC2880, expiration date April 1987.
As a result, 7 people who consumed the lethal capsules in the Chicago metropolitan area lost their lives. This led to a nationwide recall of all Tylenol products by its manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson. The company also worked with the FDA to introduce sealed bottles, which has now become the industry standard.
When you opened a bottle of Tylenol in the early 1980s, or any product for that matter, you didn't see this protective seal. Now it's the law.
In 1983, it became a federal crime to tamper with consumer goods after U.S. Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Bill. Amanda Todd. In September of 2012, a video was uploaded on YouTube in which a girl shared the story of her mental health issues using a set of flashcards. About a month later, the clip began gaining traction after it was reported that the girl, Amanda Todd from Canada, had taken her own life.
Because she's just had so much going on, she just had enough, I guess.
We now know that her death was the culmination of a 3-year nightmare.
According to reports, this was largely as a result of being harassed and blackmailed by a man online. Todd's senseless death sparked national discussions on cyberstalking and mental health. This led Canadian politicians to pass Bill C-13, which makes it a crime to distribute private images of another person without their consent.
Purpose is to prevent harm. And we believe that all of these provisions are necessary.
It also includes provisions that could help law enforcement investigate and prosecute such cases. George Floyd. The 2020 murder of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota sparked protests across the United States and around the world.
Polls suggest that between 15 and 26 million people in the U.S. alone attended at least one protest or rally in June of 2020, which is estimated to be one of the largest protest movements in U.S. history.
In addition to demanding justice for Floyd, many demonstrators also called for broad police reform and an end to police brutality. Although the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act passed the House of Representatives, it faced opposition in the Senate and negotiations collapsed. However, in response to the incident, Presidents Donald Trump and Joe Biden both signed executive orders that address police training and accountability. In addition, more than 20 states in the U.S. and the District of Columbia enacted laws around police reform aimed at preventing such tragic violence from happening again. Son of Sam. There have been various Son of Sam type laws introduced over the years, but the general goal is always the same: to prevent criminals from profiting from their crimes after conviction.
The detectives of the Brooklyn Omega Squad, part of that 300-cop 44-killer manhunt, captured the man they say is Son of Sam.
This goes back to the fear that David Berkowitz, the notorious Son of Sam, would seek a book or movie deal while in prison to tell his story.
I believe that I was demon-possessed.
Different states have drafted their own version of this law, only for some of them to be struck down as unconstitutional. In New York State, victims and their families will receive notification if the criminal earns more than $10,000 from telling their story. It's a delicate balance between freedom of speech and profiting from tragedy. Sylvia Lyens. If you see a child being maltreated, you generally have only a moral obligation to inform the authorities.
I was told today by Sylvia's sister that people heard that girl screaming from 4 houses away and did nothing.
However, in the state of Indiana, turning a blind eye could result in you being charged with a crime. Referred to as the mandated reporter law, this was enacted largely due to the murder of Sylvia Lyens. Lyens and her sister had been left in the care of Gertrude Banishevsky while their parents traveled with a carnival. Instead of caring for her, Banishevsky, along with some of her children and neighbors, made Lyens' life a living hell and caused her eventual death on October 26, 1965.
Her parents left her in the care of Gertrude Banishevsky. Just a month later, she was dead.
Although some neighbors reported hearing Lyens scream for help, not enough was done to save the girl's life. Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. The two individuals in our next entry may not have known each other, but their place in history was vital towards the expanding of hate crime definition in the United States. The Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act was introduced and passed in the fall of 2009 after both men lost their lives as a result of prejudice and bigotry.
This afternoon I signed into law the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act.
The law not only made it easier for federal authorities to investigate cases of this nature, but the act also expanded wording to include crimes perpetrated due to one's gender or sexual identity.
It's one of the mysteries that keeps you going. I can't ever really know what he might have been able to accomplish, but I have a pretty good idea of what we can accomplish in his name.
Although it cannot make up for the senseless loss of these two lives, it has arguably helped many people seek justice in the wake of such crimes. The Port Arthur Massacre. The town of Port Arthur in Tasmania, Australia, was the site of one of the most horrendous crimes in the country's history.
We went to war for a day. You never forget it, and you really never get completely over it, but you learn to live with it.
On April 28, 1996, Martin Bryant claimed the lives of 35 people and injured 23 others using a semi-automatic rifle. The massacre shocked the entire nation and led to a nationwide debate on gun control laws in Australia. In the wake of the tragedy, the Australian government moved swiftly to introduce the National Firearms Agreement, or NFA.
You know, we had the National Firearms Agreement, as was mentioned in the package, come into force 25 years ago, and, it's worked. We haven't seen an event like that again.
This agreement significantly restricted access to automatic and semi-automatic weapons, and also included a buyback program for the newly banned firearms. Since then, Australia has seen a considerable decrease in gun-related deaths. Emmett Till. In 1955, Emmett Till, an African-American teenager, was visiting relatives in Mississippi when he was lynched for allegedly flirting with a white woman. Despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt, Till's killers were acquitted by an all-white jury. The trial and subsequent outrage over the verdict helped galvanize the civil rights movement and led to the passage of multiple landmark laws.
Rosa Parks said it was Till's face she saw when refusing to give up her seat on an Alabama bus. Martin Luther King Jr. summoned his memory during the Montgomery bus boycott.
In 2008, the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act was enacted, allowing for the investigation and prosecution of racially motivated crimes that occurred before 1970. This was followed by the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act in 2022, which recognizes lynching as a federal hate crime.
President Biden signed the first law that makes lynching a federal hate crime, passed unanimously in the Senate this month.
These laws serve as a commitment to seek justice for victims of racial violence. Polyclass. Polyclass was taken from her home during a slumber party on October 1, 1993, and the tragedy had far-reaching effects on California legislature. For starters, support for 3 strikes laws earned a lot of traction. Her kidnapper, Richard Allen Davis, had a lengthy criminal record, though there were no open warrants when police initially stopped him after being notified of a suspicious car. The idea that felony criminals should serve automatic life sentences when they commit multiple serious crimes was made easy by Davis's repugnant and unrepentant behavior during the trial. Furthermore, California Highway Patrol expanded access to their all-points bulletins to local authorities in the aftermath of Polly's death. Rebecca Schaefer. Living life in the public eye isn't easy, especially when stalkers and obsessed fans come into play. This was unfortunately what caused the loss of a young and promising star in the form of My Sister Sam actress Rebecca Schaefer.
Thanks for coming, Brandon. And Sam says that you're welcome here anytime you want.
Robert John Bardo stalked the actress for years, attempting to crash the set of My Sister Sam, and even hiring a private investigator to find out where Schaefer lived via the California Department of Motor Vehicles. Bardo eventually shot Schaefer at her home, and her death prompted lawmakers to draft stricter anti-stalking legislation in its wake.
I couldn't live with myself and say she was a wonderful girl and we loved her and we missed her, and not try to affect it.
The Driver's Privacy Protection Act was also made into law after this incident, making it more difficult for others to find personal information via the DMV. Johnny Gosch.
We're waiting for you to come home. We're doing everything in our power to get you back.
This cold case was the subject of a 2014 documentary titled Who Took Johnny? But it also changed how police respond to reports of missing children. Johnny Gosch was taken during his paper route in the early morning hours of September 5, 1982. and he has not been seen since. At the time of his disappearance, policy in Des Moines, Iowa stated that someone couldn't be labeled as a missing person until 72 hours had gone by. The Gosh case resulted in legislation that changed all of this, making it easier for police to begin an investigation. The Johnny Gosh bill requires authorities to immediately treat all missing persons reports of a child as credible and to respond accordingly. Megan Kanka. How well do you really know your neighbor? This was the inspiration behind Megan's Law, a subsection of laws that require the public to be able to access information of convicted sex offenders in their area.
A neighbor who lived diagonally from my house was outside, and he lured her into his home to see a puppy dog.
The specific case was that of 7-year-old Megan Kanka, whose neighbor, Jesse Temendekwas, lured and assaulted her before taking her life. Temendekwas' criminal history with little to no rehabilitation was not available to Kanka's family. And as a local assemblyman by the name of Paul Kramer was quoted as saying, quote, Megan Kanka would be alive today had a public registry been easily accessible by her family.
I don't think about him at all, and I like that, and I thought he took so much from us that I wasn't going to let him take any more.
Ernesto Miranda. You've heard it a million times on television and in movies, but do you know the actual origins behind your Miranda rights?
You're under arrest! You know the routine.
Very good. You have the right to remain silent. Now what else?
Although Ernesto Miranda was a criminal and his second trial did have the same results of a conviction, it's the circumstances of his arrest that changed the law. This was because Miranda wasn't informed of his right to remain silent so as not to incriminate himself, and was also, quote, refused an opportunity to consult with his counsel.
Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. If you cannot afford to hire a lawyer, one will be appointed to represent you before any questioning if you wish one.
His confession was deemed inadmissible as evidence, and the state of Arizona had to retry him with said confession omitted from the record. The Supreme Court case Miranda v. Arizona now requires that all arresting officers inform you of your right to silence and an attorney.
The department was forced to drop the charges because you forgot to read him his Miranda rights.
Amber Hagerman. Most people are familiar with Amber Alerts. They inform us whenever the case of a child going missing is reported in our area.
Confirming the abduction. Amber Alert. Holly White. Female. 18 months.
However, it's vitally important that we remember the alert's namesake, Amber Hagerman. While riding her bicycle back in 1996, Hagerman was taken and murdered. Her killer has never been found. The case increased demand for immediate response to any sort of similar report involving minors. And today, Amber Alerts go out on radio, television, telephone, internet, and highway communication devices in order to maximize public awareness and response.
We have an Amber Alert for 16-year-old Samantha Renee Wilcox of Wichita.
There are also related alerts for missing seniors, called Silver Alerts, and police, known as Blue Alerts. Adam Walsh. The abduction and death of Adam Walsh is arguably the most well-known case on this list, thanks largely to the public presence of Walsh's father, John, as the host of America's Most Wanted.
For 27 years, we've been asking, who could take a 6-year-old boy?
Still, it is impossible to overstate how much the Walsh family has worked to help the families of victims over the years, as Adam's case was responsible, in part, for the establishment of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Adam's taking from a Florida mall was also the impetus for the Code Adam program that's used in retail environments. An employee will now page information over the intercom to help find a child that's been reported as having disappeared.
There were cops who said, well, depending on the age of the kid, we're going to wait 24 hours. If it's over a certain age, we're going to wait 48 hours. The first 4 hours are crucial.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. Kitty Genevies.
Call red, call 911, call red, call 911.
Dialing 911 seems like such an instinctive act that it's easy to forget this wasn't always how emergencies were called into police. Kitty Genevies was followed, assaulted, and stabbed by Winston Mosley while she was returning home after a late-night shift working at a bar. The crime had multiple witnesses in the form of Geneviese's neighbors, but some were reportedly too scared to call police, while others had difficulty getting through on a line.
People are looking out their windows. They see Kitty Genevies here. They see her struggle to her feet.
At the time, any emergencies would be called into the operator, who would then transfer the call to the appropriate authorities only when they had the opportunity to do so.
You didn't see anything? She was lying in that courtyard all night. It was dark.
This delayed response would, in part, influence the establishment of the 911 emergency system we use today. Do you know of any other true crime cases that influence the law? Let us know in the comments.
Do you trust the police? Do you trust courts? Do you trust your state government? Do you trust your federal government?